Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this fall session of the Digital Media Academy Speaker Series for leading STEAM educators and school leaders. My name is Chris Bennett. I'm so excited to be hosting this series focused on the challenges facing K-12 school leaders and preparing young leaders for the fields for tomorrow. Today's session is entitled The Power of Generative AI for Learning, and I'm pleased to shortly introduce you to our guest, Josh Weiss. Before I introduce Josh, I'd like to introduce myself and share briefly about Digital Media Academy. My name is Chris Bennett. I am a longtime video game designer and an affiliate at Stanford University Graduate School of Education. I'm also the engagement specialist at Digital Media Academy. Digital Media Academy was founded in 1999 on the campus of Stanford University, and our flagship program, Leading STEAM Schools in the World, is a membership program that offers a complete, ready-to-use solution for K-12 schools that combines comprehensive STEAM curriculum, tailored consultation, and a supportive global community that empowers educators to meet the demands of 21st century leaders. This public speaker series is brought to you by the Digital Media Academy team and is available globally through the Leading STEAM Schools in the World community. So why are we here? This series aims to connect you with leading thinkers and change makers to unlock the tools and knowledge needed to lead K-12 education change. Without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Josh Weiss, our guest for today's session. Josh is Director of Digital Learning Solutions at Stanford University Graduate School of Education. He partners with professors, researchers, and practitioners to strategize, design, develop, and iterate digital learning solutions and experiences. He thinks deeply about technology in the classroom and how it can make learning more effective when used in the right way, and how technology can scale to the diverse needs and interests of students in a way that a teacher alone cannot. Josh, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chris. This is really awesome, and I'm honored to be here with y'all.
Thank you. So first, tell us a little bit about your journey. What brought you to where you are right now?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a journey here. Come with me. Right out of college, I decided to become a teacher, and I was actually a middle school English teacher for 7 years, but it was actually at a few different types of places. I was a teacher in Hawaii, of all places, where I taught at a Title I school, which in the United States means most of the students are on free or reduced lunch. And I taught there for a few years. After that, I actually moved to Brazil. I taught in some American schools in Brazil. I was also teaching middle school and high school reading and writing curriculum like you would in the US, but to Brazilian and international students at private schools in Brazil. And I was in Sao Paulo for 2 years, and I was in Salvador in the northeast of Brazil for 2 years as well. And then I started using more and more tech in my classroom. I started taking on more leadership roles with that kind of thing, and I went back to school, came back to the US, and went to Boston, where I pivoted into learning about education technology. And I did some courses and I did some work and learned that that's something I'm really passionate about, is how to help teachers and students make more of learning with technology. And just as importantly, being intentional, not just slapping technology onto a problem, but thinking about what are we trying to solve and what does the research say about how we can solve this for learners and educators. So fast forward a little bit, and I moved out to California. I've been at Stanford for 7 years. I was a technologist for a time, and now I'm actually the Director of Digital Learning Solutions, as Chris mentioned. And my team really connects with learners, educators, and researchers to think about how to find digital learning solutions to their digital learning problems. Right now, living in Silicon Valley, artificial intelligence is definitely a topic of conversation, and I'm really excited to dive into that with y'all today.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. I'm going to start with an easy question for you. Some feel that ChatGPT should just be banned, while others say it's here to stay. What approach do you think we should take for that?
You know, yesterday I was talking about this with a colleague. At one point we just sat back and said to each other, what a time to be alive. Like, the disruption and the opportunity here is really enormous. And I just want to take a step back and say, like, this feels like a big moment. So it makes sense that we are trying to grapple with some big decisions in a big moment like this. And there's not easy answers to this, but maybe there's a few ways of thinking about this. So AI detectors are one way of trying to keep students from using AI. But we really can't start with that as an initial point of this discussion because AI detectors simply do not work. They have too many false positives, meaning it falsely accuses students or learners or anybody really of using AI when they in fact did not use AI. So the technology is not 100% reliable, and therefore it's going to run the risk of accusing people who haven't done anything wrong. So in a classroom setting, that's just not a good starter. Classrooms are about trust and about learning with each other along the way and having really strong connections where you can lean on each other. As a former teacher, I really value the trust with my students, and I see the people I work with having that as paramount with their students. So if it erodes trust, to me, that's problematic from the outset. On top of that, there's also research coming out of Stanford that it is especially biased towards non-native English speakers, meaning it falsely accuses students who don't have English at home more than it would students who do have English at home, right? So for a couple reasons there, it feels like AI detectors for right now is not the way to go. So with that in mind, we are basically thinking about how to either embrace this thing or to mitigate how it can be used in the classroom. And there's a few ways of really trying to push back against how students are using it. But if we can't do this thing, then it's going to be a lot of energy to try and either fight it, or we can push that energy towards thinking about how it can actually augment the learning process. So let's talk about that augmenting a little bit just to kind of play with that scenario as well. What does GPT do well? And I'll use the word GPT for all types of things here. ChatGPT, Bard, Claude, all the different bots. We'll call it GPT for right now. What does GPT do well? Well, it can be an oracle that gives you answers. You give it a question, it gives you an answer back, right? The problem there is it's often more confident than it is competent. So it'll give you a very confident answer, but you don't really have any idea of how correct that is. And the reason is because the way these systems are designed is they want to give you an answer and they basically want to make you happy. So they'll give you an answer even if it isn't a fully true or even fully accurate answer to begin with, and they don't have the basis to answer that in any kind of factual way because they're trying to make you happy, right? And there's ways around this. You can put into your prompt, if you don't know, tell me you don't know. But as a starter, it's not going to do that for you, right? And we call these hallucinations, right? It hallucinates that it has authority or competency in this thing, and then it tells you this thing, right? So GPT as a question answering technology is okay, but you can't rely on it 100% of the time, right? But what else can GPT do as well? Right? We're thinking about how this kind of plays in the classroom. Well, it's really good at helping you to get started and to get unstuck. And in the learning process, and even for teachers as well, and I would say everybody all the way up to the top of a school district, everybody has those moments where you have trouble getting started or getting unstuck. You're looking at a blank piece of paper and you need to write an email to somebody or write a report or start, you have a blank page, right? In good teaching, you don't have to just face that page daunted by yourself for long. You can say, you know what, let me talk to my elbow partner. Let me get some ideas from others. Let me kind of get my ideas sparked. And then when I feel like my train is running down the tracks, I can go with that momentum. GPT can do this as well. And it actually does it quite well because it's not giving you an answer, but rather it's giving you a suggestion. And it's really good at remembering what has been talked about before. So it can kind of have this long-term conversation, right? You can talk for 5 minutes, and it can remember what's happening that whole 5 minutes and kind of pull that together. Similarly, it can help you to get unstuck. There's lots of parts of the learning process where you feel like, okay, I kind of hit a wall with this thing, right? So what does it look like to get unstuck? If you're lucky, maybe you have an older sibling, you have a parent at home, you have a family friend, maybe even a teacher after school that can help you get unstuck. But if you don't have that, would it be nice to have as an alternative or kind of a second option, something like GPT that can help you to get unstuck with these things as well? So I think that's an interesting part of this conversation as well, not just spitting out an essay, but rather being a conversational partner and helping you to get through these points of confusion or difficulty. And, you know, I don't think we have the full scope on what this thing can do. It's very early right now. The technology has really only been available for less than a year on a grand scale. And there's definitely more work to be done on this to really understand where it sits in the classroom. One thing that has come up a lot lately is it representative of all backgrounds and all languages and all cultures? And the answer is no, right? GPT by itself, ChatGPT, is pre-trained, that's the P, it's pre-trained on a part of the internet that was pre-selected by technology. That I think this part of Reddit and this part of Wikipedia and this part of this book, I think they should be a part of this robot brain, right? But as you may well know, the internet is overly representative of English-speaking culture, language, and interaction, right? Even if English isn't your language at home, a lot of times English is kind of the lingua franca, the common language that we're speaking, right? And I mean, the statistic that I've seen on this that's most reliable is that 5% of the world speaks English at home, but 64% of the internet communication is in English, right? So we still have a ways to go to make this equally representative of all the languages that are not just using English first or secondarily within an English type of forum, right? What does that look like? Well, there are some interesting efforts on this. There's a company called Cohere. They have a project called Aya. And the whole idea is to start to crowdsource more languages and more inputs from other languages so that we can build a robot brain that's more equally representative of the types of people around the world that are going to be accessing this from their language as well. So to my mind, that's going to be helping this a little bit as we think about what is the approach to this thing as not just answering our questions and being kind of a one-time oracle, but as a part of a collaboration process and thinking through problems together.
Thanks for digging into that. I appreciate it. It made me think about especially two things that you talked about helping you to get unstuck and helping to spark new ideas. Oftentimes we think about working with a computer or working with a technology on one-to-one. Do you have any thoughts around having ChatGPT help you to get unstuck or spark new ideas if you're collaborating with others?
Absolutely. There's actually a researcher, Mike Sharples, and he has this thing called social generative AI. And the idea is, can it be a part of, I think what you're implying here, like have 4 people in a group, and that's a very common structure we see in all levels of education. Could one of those members of the group be a chatbot that contributes in ways of getting unstuck, sees what's going on, or gets a prompt from somebody in the group, hey, we can't quite get over this part of the word problem. I'm not sure what to look at to get past this part of the math that I'm not understanding, and give a little suggestion, right? Very famously, Khan Academy has a bot now called Khanmigo, and that's the basis of this bot. They don't want it to give you answers, but they do want it to guide you towards the answers. And that's called the Socratic method. It's been used since, you can guess it, Socrates, and probably before then as well, but it's credited to Socrates in a lot of ways. And the idea is nudging towards an answer is as valuable, or in some ways even more valuable, than just getting the answer itself, right? And so that's the premise of what Khan Academy is building right now, is nudging you towards the answer in a way that you can kind of make sense of it yourself, but you don't feel frustrated for long because you're not sitting there and wondering, where should I go next with this?
There's a little bit of that helping a learner to feel kind of clever, that they've kind of figured it out themselves.
That's right. There's definitely an emotional aspect to this as well. I think each of us, when we get something and we want to feel like, hey, that's something that I should celebrate myself, you're looking for a cue from others. So finding that cue in group mates, from adults, from peers, or even from something that looks like AI is something that could help reinforce, yeah, this is something that I'm good at and I could get better at if I wanted to.
It's interesting because as a game designer, it makes me think about how one of the most powerful moments in games are when we help a player feel clever. They figured out the puzzle on their own. It wasn't all just given to them before. And there's a real emotional response and a piece of learning that happens there. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, if you're curious, the term for that in some parts of research is self-efficacy. It's the belief that I'm the type of person that can achieve this type of thing. And it is closely linked to your ability to actually get that thing done.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So another question, to what extent is AI in the classroom already? For those teachers that are thinking about AI in their classroom, what might that transition into kind of AI boosted instruction look like?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people are thinking about this right now. The short answer is it's in the classroom more than we probably think, right? So there's been a lot of surveys and studies, and the numbers have been quite varied, actually. But the strongest indicators that I've seen are that in some parts of North America, at least, over 50% of teachers have tried out ChatGPT. And very interestingly, and a lot of times that's more than the students have tried it out, percentage-wise. I find that very interesting trend. This was based on data from March, so maybe a little bit different from now. But let's say as of March, that's true. The other piece of data that came out that kind of piqued my interest was that Black and Latino teachers actually used ChatGPT with greater frequency than other teachers did as well, which I find really interesting. What's happening in that situation? I think that's a great research question. Why are people feeling a connection and empowerment with this type of thing, or maybe just a curiosity with this as well? So the short answer is yes, it's being used as much by instructors as by students, is what the early data is showing us. The other part of that is that the data we're seeing is among the general population, there's still a lot of people who have not played with ChatGPT, right? So there's a little bit of a gulf here, a little bit of an area in between. People haven't played with it, and we would guess that that would erode over time. But I'm not totally sure. I'm not totally sure about that. It seems like an open research question. Is it this group of people who is using it consistently and people who are consistently not using it, and are they staying separate, or is this a slow movement from one camp to the other? I think over time it will probably move in that direction, but at what rate? I think that really depends upon the person. If it's a teacher, like their classroom, every teacher's classroom is different, right? So the other question you asked as well is, what might the transition to AI-boosted instruction look like? This is a tough one. And again, this is really dependent upon the classroom, what you're trying to teach, where you are in the world. My classrooms in North America look different from my classrooms in South America, right? But let's start here. If you could have a classroom assistant, what would you hand off to that classroom assistant, right? You have basically a teaching assistant, right? They're not a full teacher, so you can't give them a full lesson to do, right? But they could help with bits and pieces of your day, especially if you can give them really clear directions, probably a few examples of what you think good work would look like if they were to achieve this thing. And then at the end, you'd probably have to kind of check in with them and say, hey, how did it go? Show me what you did. Oh, next time, actually, can you do it in this way a little bit differently, right? A lot of times AI is kind of in that same space as a teaching assistant. In other ways, it's not. I'll talk about that later on. But as far as things like grading assignments, setting up initial lesson plan ideas that you can hone and craft further yourself, developing summaries of assignments for students, study guides, putting together a study guide from a whole bunch of lessons that you've done from a textbook, right? These are things classically that teaching assistants can help with if you have that kind of in your school. There are a lot of startups right now in places like Silicon Valley that are trying at this thing. And it's a really hard problem because a lot is lost when you hand it from a human to a bot, because not everything is just a simple set of instructions. There's a lot of implications. There's a lot of ineffable little points of contact, picking up on how this thing was done before and kind of folding it in by watching somebody else model it and do it. A lot of this is lost when you're trying to just give someone a written set of instructions. But you can still get a lot of this done through good example giving. So that's a really interesting area of research right now. They call that shot, giving something few shot or zero shot. Can you give it a few examples or no examples, and seeing how it can complete a task based upon something like that. And the last thing I'll say about this real quickly is that when thinking about AI boosts in the classroom, one question I've gotten a lot is, where does AI notch into the instruction? In other words, what is the segment of my instruction? Not just the administrative tasks like grading and stuff like that, but the instruction itself. Where does it notch in? You know, I'll start with thinking about Bloom's taxonomy on this one, which in North America is a common way of thinking about how to take a learner from a very basic skill level to a very advanced skill level. So basic is something like identifying. Think of a chemistry class. Can you identify 10 of the elements on the periodic table? And slowly you move them into more advanced things like evaluating which of these is more volatile elements. And then at the end, you're actually creating your own thing as well. So create your own periodic table of elements for Mars or something like that, right? So you're moving them slowly into these more complex tasks, right? There's a really interesting chart that just came out of Oregon State University showing that you can notch AI into each of these slices if you think about it very intentionally, but you can't accomplish all of these slices, right? So what the part that is human for each of these is a really interesting question. And I think it's going to require some playing with these. What are the parts of the evaluation process that the AI could help me or help students with, right? And then what are the parts of the evaluation process that really students do better and should do on their own? So they're kind of learning this part of the skill, right? So I would say start with something that feels familiar to you, a framework. For me, Bloom's taxonomy feels familiar. Thinking about where you kind of slide potentially AI into each of these little slices in a way that you otherwise might have just had a conversation with somebody in the teacher's lounge. Like, hey, what are you doing to help students evaluate? Oh, I do this activity, I do this activity. Well, how would that look if you were to have an AI to bounce it off of? Oh, what would you do and what would I do? And thinking about kind of collaborating in that kind of a way.
Thanks for that thoughtful response. It made me think about something that I don't have data for, but I've heard so much anecdotally that there are probably millions of people who have tried ChatGPT once or twice, and either they've said, wow, this is magic, I'm not sure how I would use it, or they try to do A with it and A doesn't work, and they go, well, this doesn't really work for me, right? There's not a lot of investment into it. It's kind of this magic tool, but it's either magic for them or it isn't.
Hmm.
And I have to imagine that there's a lot of that's happening with a lot of teachers as well. What might be interesting ways to encourage teachers to kind of continue this approach to help kind of build those muscles that they'll need over time to really make it a partner of theirs?
Absolutely. Let me use some teaching language here. So
Okay.
some curricula is a linear curricula, and some curricula is a spiraling curricula. So linear curricula is something like algebra. You have to learn this thing before you can learn this thing. You have to learn this thing before you can learn this thing. A spiraling curriculum is where you loop back to something time and time again to build a more robust idea of what this thing is. So you might be guessing there at home, linear is like kind of like math kind of stuff a lot of times, or hard science is having more step by step. But things like history and English, they're more spiraling. You kind of come back to it from time to time and you build a better picture of what a metaphor can be, or the causes of World War II, right? It's a very complex thing that you can't get at one time. You have to kind of come back to it and build that model in your head. I would argue that GPT is more like the spiraling curriculum because it's too many things to too many different people, right? It can be just a way for you to plan your vacation, which some people are doing. And if that happens to be the first way you played with it, then you're blown away. You're like, this thing is amazing. It is my travel agent forevermore, right? But if you go into it and you say, do this calculation for me, you're going to be really disappointed because that's not the thing that it does very well, right? So maybe it doesn't work for you in that case, but coming back to it time and time again is, I think, the best way to find out. And not to put too fine a point on it, but this technology is very different from clicking a button and getting an expected result. It's working on probabilities. So based upon the way that you ask a question, it's going to say, I think the best answer is most probably this answer. But that's going to change person to person, day to day, and sentence to sentence, because probabilities are never 100%, right? And so if it doesn't work for that day, it could be a number of things. It could be the way you ask the question. It could be the way that you set up an example. It could even be the version of the robot brain that's currently running, and later on it's going to get better at answering that type of thing. So the best way is to keep playing with it, spiraling back to it, and then sharing out your cases with other people and seeing how they're using it.
Thank you. Let's turn our attention to students. This is a huge change for students right now. What do you think are the skills that will still be relevant for our current K-12 students in the near future? What should we be doubling down on in this age of generative AI as we're all learning this at the same time?
Yeah. Well, let me start off with kind of the writing angle, and then I'll get a little more general from there as well. I think improbably original and improbably interesting writing is going to be important in the future just as much as it is right now, right? So I'll give you an example. When I was an international baccalaureate teacher, it's kind of like a program like AP where you have kind of advanced classes. Their rubric for grading was partly about quality of expression, but it was also quality of idea. So if you gave an idea, you gave an analysis of a poem, and it sounded like everybody else's analysis, you get an okay score, but you were never going to get a good score, right? If you gave them an improbably original answer that you could back up, that's how you got the good score. And so when I was a teacher, I was always pushing for that for my students. I said, yeah, you can give the average answer, and that's fine. But the really interesting answer is going to get you the good grade. And that's probably, honestly, a good skill for life as well. If you can stand out with an improbably original idea, you're going to get more, you're going to be more marketable in your skills because your skills rise above what is expected of a person in that position, right? So let's take that to GPT as well. What does GPT do? It gives you the most probable answer, right? It doesn't give you improbably original answers. It's not what it's made for. And so is that an important skill now, but an important skill later? I think so. I think original is not just combining ideas in a way they've been combined before. It's going to be really important. And as far as keeping up with the pace of technology and climate change and all these things like that, being an original thinker, being adaptive, and being able to self-construct and sense make in new and original ways is just going to be a life skill for all of us, right? Being adaptive is always at the top of what people want for their skills in the workplace. And I think that's because to keep up, you have to just be an adaptive and original thinker, right? So I'll say that is number one. More generally speaking, being able to frame how you learn and collaborate with others on how you learn is really, really important as a general skill. We call this metacognition. It's the idea that you can reflect on how you learn now and how you'd like to learn going forward and kind of coaching yourself in some ways. It also means you're sitting across from somebody and they're trying to teach you something and you understand what is not making sense to you and you can communicate back to them, hey, this was the thing that actually tripped me up and confused me. Can you stop, explain that to me, and then we can move on, right? So learning how to learn and learning how to help others teach you along the way. It's metacognition is what this is called. That's super important now. It will always be an important skill because you're going to be learning throughout your whole life, right? But now collaborating with AIs, it's really important to be a reflective individual. This is true for students and educators all the way up to the top of a school district. It's really important to be reflective of what are we learning and why are we learning, that kind of thing, and can we teach ourselves better and better over time. And collaborating with AI is just going to become more and more important. We're already seeing classrooms that are using it inside of instruction as this getting started and getting unstuck kind of mechanism. And I think students are using it a lot for that as well in their own time. So what are the skills to being a good collaborator and co-working through a task and kind of designing for your own learning? It's a lot of stopping the knowledge transfer part of learning and having a moment to kind of reflect on what are we learning and how do we learn that thing better over time as well. And that's something in my classroom I really appreciated. At the end of a unit, we'd have a portfolio of things we've created. And we'd stop and we'd say, where did we start with our learning? Where did we end? What were the hardest parts of developing this portfolio of projects and learning artifacts? If we could do this again, how would we do it differently so we could learn more effectively? And those kind of reflective moments at the end of the unit, I think, are very important, especially as we're going to be thinking about how we interact with humans, but maybe also AIs throughout our learning process as well. And the last thing I'll say is just getting better at AI literacy, I think, is really important. Generative AI is putting a lot of new learning objects into the world. That can be new essays, it can be articles, but more and more it's things like podcasts, it's things like videos, right? It's now possible to type in a command in English and a video pops out, right? So if all of this new content is coming at us, that's a lot of noise. So where's the signal in that noise of what you want to spend your time on to get to your learning goal, right? And I think that's going to be a really important skill, is this AI literacy of like, what is AI, but then also how do we navigate all of the content that's being produced or co-produced with AI and make meaning for ourselves so we don't feel overwhelmed as learners and educators, but rather can harness the best parts of that. And by the way, there's going to be some amazing learning objects being produced because of everybody can now do these types of things, right? So people who before had this great knowledge in their head and they couldn't give it to everybody else, they now have a media can turn their ideas into a YouTube video. So there will be some really innovative presentations of this stuff by people who have not been in the mix on this traditionally. But how can you find that really good content and know that it's worth your time? I think finding the signal from the noise is really important for learners.
Interesting. That really made me think about some trends that I've seen. When a year and a half ago, when ChatGPT 3 first came out, there was all of these YouTube videos and conversations on programming is done. Like, programmers saying, am I going to have a job in a year? 9 months ago, when Midjourney came out, hundreds of videos from artists saying, well, I guess art isn't a thing anymore, right? And we start to hear similar things now from teachers and a lot of students saying, what am I going to do in my career when this comes out? But what it seems like that you're saying is find a way to harness generative AI to not only be your learning partner, but kind of your accelerator as well.
Absolutely. And it's going to become more and more important, I think, from keeping an even playing ground that everybody, if they want to, can be boosted by this, right? It's in its own way, it's kind of performance enhancing, right? And if there's people who are equipped with this and people who are not equipped with this, just because they're more familiar with the tool, I mean, it's not dissimilar from somebody who has facility with Google Docs versus somebody who's using a typewriter. You're going to get way more done in your life using Google Docs because of all the things that technology allows you to do versus a typewriter where you're constrained on so many different ways, not least of which is just sharing with people and collaborating, right? So think of those two. Now think of a third category of someone who can not only have the affordances of Google Docs, but the Google Docs with a little AI button that says, do you want some help with that? You look like you're kind of stuck. Let's think about this together, right? And this is not pie in the sky hypothetical stuff. This is stuff that's being actively developed right now for the Microsoft and Google tools, right? So you'll be seeing this button popping up sooner than we think in the corner. What does it look like to be productive with these things? So we're all leveling up and we're not leaving people, not empowered by these things, or at least if they want to use these things as well. To me, it's an equity question. Are we giving everybody who wants a chance to level up in this a chance to do that thing so that they can boost their own creativity and productivity if that's something they want to do?
Interesting. Let's kind of change direction and think a little bit about things from the school leader's perspective, perhaps. What might be a useful framework for thinking about generative AI that applies for K-12 schools?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it has to start with what role you think AI is going to take, right? So it can be a lot of different things. It can help with, on an administrative level, data analysis, right? It can also be an after-school tutor, right? It can be a guidance counselor, right? It can be all of these things, not to the level of a real guidance counselor. It doesn't have all the intuition and all the built-up knowledge and wisdom that a guidance counselor would have, but it does have the ability to have some conversations that can start off with guidance counselor kind of topics, and then real guidance counselors, I think, should take over and kind of polish that conversation from the human level as well. But my point is, it could take all of these different roles. Which is the role that you want to focus on, or maybe a small handful of roles? Because if you try and chase 5 rabbits, you won't catch any of them, right? So focus on one of those. And I'll give you an example. One that I've seen growing within classrooms is kind of a question buddy. Students really excel when they can ask the right types of questions. But there's only one teacher in my classroom, is 27 students. So 1 to 27 ratio is really hard. So how do you get students to just, in a lesson plan, like develop good questions, right? We know that's a really crucial skill. It's based on a lot of standards and assessments, right? Getting that personalized touch with something as small as a task of how to ask good questions. That's an interesting idea. Let's ask your question in this type of way. that can really take a lot of load off of that 1:27 ratio. But you have to be really deliberate that that's the outcome you want. I want my students to get better at this standard because that is something in our assessment data that we need to work on. The other thing I would say as well is, one metaphor for this is, if you had a new employee at the school in any position, what would you give them on the first day? And what would you not give them on the first day? There's certain types of knowledge that are built up over time, which we've spoken about. But there's also a certain amount of trust that's built up over time when you bring a stranger into a trust-driven environment like a school as well. So what does it look like to pressure test or evaluate someone who's coming into your school? What are some intro tasks, little piloty small tasks to say, hey, how well can they do this thing? How well can they do this thing? You would never throw somebody into a full role right away. You'd have them ideally shadowing somebody or getting a sense of how the environment works, or at least some kind of a training. So what does that training or orientation look like? And how would you do that if you were to try to do a bot for one of these roles? I think that takes a lot of intention. It takes a lot of good examples so that the bot can kind of understand what you're driving at when you say collaborate or belonging or skills assessment. So building these kind of like personalized training sets, I think, is something that some companies are actually working on right now, and I think can be done at an administrative level of kind of gathering good examples for what a role should be, and then kind of trying that out in a small way.
Interesting. This kind of makes me think about, we're having all sorts of Q&A pop in here, and it's making me think about trust, which I've seen mentioned in several of these questions. One questioner said, ChatGPT could be problematic for teachers because it's trying to please you, right? And then when it messes up, it says, oh, sorry, how about this? And kind of that feeling of whether or not you can trust it or not, but also kind of the follow-up to that of, as teachers and school administrators and students are kind of engaged in the relationship with this ChatGPT, eventually we're going to trust it as someone kind of in an actual relationship, right? And we kind of because we want to humanize things. What do you think this kind of means in the long run? Not in the first couple months of having it in your classroom, but as it becomes it kind of becomes your robot TA. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah. There's a great sci-fi story from Tim Chang. If you've ever seen the movie Arrival, he wrote the story that's based off of. And in this story, there's a bunch of bots, and they kind of grow and learn over time. It takes years for this small group of dedicated researchers and hobbyists to really get up to speed with how to interact with these bots, right? And there's other groups that are trying to like really fast forward this thing, and you can kind of do that. But one thing that the story tries to impart is that experience is not compressible, right? There's certain elements of, hey, if this happens, then do this. You can kind of hand that off to people, right? Like a PDF of best practices. But what doesn't fit in that PDF that you would have to earn in the hard way over time, right? Like, oh yeah, if I could make a PDF for myself, it would actually, I would rephrase this best practice as this thing, and I would add a little caveat that also when this thing happens, watch out for this. So you can call that intuition. But it's really hard to compress that because it's just earned by over time trying out different things and seeing how they work, applying your hypothesis or what you think is going to happen and seeing how it actually happens in real life. So that just takes time. So patience, I think, is going to be some component of this as well, but it's not easy. I really feel I feel for folks who say, it doesn't feel like there's a quick solution here. And I think that's right. I think it's a matter of testing this out for your own case, and then over time kind of tweaking what you would call your best practices versus what is like the larger constellation of wisdom that you think needs to be earned over time, and then kind of moving towards that kind of that wisdom and trust that a new employee would have to gain on their own.
Interesting. And I want to get to a couple of the great questions we have when we're done. So maybe like a succinct answer to, where do you see the future of education going right now?
Yeah, definitely. So I see also some comments in here about critical thinking. So I want to address that as well. Try and tie that in here too. So there are a lot of boosts going on with AI, but what do we not want to skip over as well? Like critical thinking is definitely one of these parts of the process too. So I think it's going to take a lot of intentionality. What are the parts of the process the learning process that are the productive struggle, that don't feel fun at the time and but in the end we know are worth it for us? And ideally also have a lot of intrinsic value. People see the value of pushing through this thing that's hard. That's a really challenging task. Building extrinsic value is easy. That's a grade, that's a diploma. But if something is worthwhile or not worthwhile is immediately detectable to everybody. I don't care if you're a student or an educator or an employee or a boss, right? If something feels worthwhile, then you'll really put your time into it. So how do we convey and design around what is worthwhile for students, and also to help them to see what's worthwhile for them as well, in a really transparent kind of way as well? So assessments. So what types of assessments really help students to advance their knowledge, test their knowledge, and evaluate where they're going next with this type of knowledge? That type of thing is really valuable, I think. So thinking about the nature of assessments that really help students on their path to learning, not just an endpoint of, you got this thing, walk away, you'll never use it again. A lot of that looks like testing for skills as much as testing for knowledge. The other thing that's, so more generally here, what do I see for the future of education? I mean, there's a Cambrian explosion of personalized learning objects, like I've mentioned, and personalized learning is going to become much easier just for that alone, right? Everyone's going to have, there's going to be more creators and therefore more content that you can pick the thing that you want, which requires, I think, a lot of more AI literacy. There's actually a group at Stanford called Craft that is building AI literacy lessons with teachers to try and help people, students and instructors, to kind of navigate this kind of thing. And the last thing I'll say is, I think it's important to focus on the personalized aspect of this. But the part of this that I think is going to be equally important is not just personalized learning, but personalized active learning. Passive learning is you sit and get, right? I tell you something, you nod along, and then we pretend like that was good. But we know from research that it's really important for you to be able to sense make and ask questions and come back with that and say, hey, this is the part that interested me the most. Can we talk about that? Or I heard about this thing in a book. Does this connect? You're kind of making sense and building this web in your head of connections. So personalized learning is good, but personalized active learning, I think, is really something that could help. And we know from learning science that active learning helps with recall, helps with building information over time, and also helps you to compound your learning journey into the direction that you want as well. So I'll pause there, but I think active learning could be a huge lever if we use these systems right.
Thank you. I'm glad we got to work in some of the Q&A into these questions, because we've come to our end of our available time today. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your own experience with us. It's been really great for me. I also want to thank again Digital Media Academy for sponsoring this series. You can find out more about the leading STEAM schools in the world membership program on the website at digitalmediaacademy.org/schools, or contact us anytime at info@digitalmediaacademy.org. And we look forward to seeing you again next month, when we'll be speaking to Joanna Lovejoy, project manager at Kinjo, about gamified learning in the classroom. On behalf of Digital Media Academy, I want to thank everyone who was able to join us today for this session, and we wish you a fantastic rest of your day. Take care.